Long before the pyramids rose above the desert, the land of Egypt was already beginning to change. Along the banks of the Nile River, small communities had slowly developed over generations. The river provided something that was almost impossible to find in the surrounding landscape: reliable water and fertile soil. Beyond the narrow green valley was the desert, dry and enormous, stretching toward the horizon. But beside the river, plants grew, animals gathered, and people could build permanent settlements. The Nile would become the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Every year, its waters rose and spread across the surrounding land. When the flood eventually receded, it left behind a layer of fertile soil. Farmers could then plant their crops in the dark earth. Wheat and barley became important crops. Vegetables were grown near the river, while flax could be cultivated and later turned into linen. For the people living along the Nile, the river was not simply part of the landscape. It was the center of life. Most of the people living in early Egypt were farmers. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons and the river. When the fields were ready, they planted crops. When the plants matured, they harvested them and stored the grain for the months ahead. Farmers also raised animals, including cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. Life was usually practical and simple. Homes were commonly constructed from mud bricks, which could be made from the soil and dried beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Inside, families cooked their food, stored supplies, slept, and carried out their daily activities. Pottery vessels were used to hold water and grain. Baskets were woven from reeds and plants growing near the river. Clothing was often made from linen. There were no large cities filled with enormous stone buildings yet. Instead, the Nile Valley was dotted with villages and small settlements. People worked, traded, raised families, and passed their knowledge from one generation to the next. Over time, however, these communities became increasingly connected. The Nile made communication and transportation much easier. All person traveling by boat could move along the river far more efficiently than someone traveling across the desert on foot. Boats carried grain, pottery, stone, animals, and other goods between settlements. The river also connected to major regions of ancient Egypt. In the north was Lower Egypt, centered around the broad Nile Delta. Here, the river divided into several branches before eventually reaching the Mediterranean Sea. Farther south was Upper Egypt, where the Nile Valley was narrower and surrounded by desert. The two regions had different landscapes, but they depended on the same river. As communities became larger, leaders gained more influence. Competition, trade, and cooperation gradually brought different settlements into closer relationships. Over generations, political power became increasingly centralized. Eventually, the separate regions would be brought together under a single kingdom. This process is traditionally associated with a ruler known as Nama. Nama is often connected with the legendary King Menes, who later Egyptian traditions remembered as an early unifier of the country. Around the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Egypt entered a new period. A centralized state was beginning to emerge. The king stood at the center of this system. But governing Egypt required many other people. Officials organized resources and supervised agricultural production. Scribes recorded information. Workers carried out construction and agricultural projects. Tax collectors gathered portions of the harvest. The growing government needed records to keep track of grain, animals, land, workers, and goods. Writing, therefore, became increasingly important. Scribes could record the amount of grain collected from a village or document goods being transported along the Nile. These records allowed the government to organize a society that was becoming larger and more complicated. But most Egyptians still lived ordinary lives. They worked in fields, workshops, boats, and homes. The great monuments of later Egypt had not yet appeared. The civilization was still in its early stages. Religion was already an important part of Egyptian life. The ancient Egyptians viewed the natural world through a religious understanding. The sun, the sky, the earth, and the Nile were all connected with powerful forces and divine beings. The yearly flooding of the Nile was especially important. The flood brought water and fertile soil to the fields, allowing crops to grow. The cycle of flooding, planting, growing, and harvesting became closely connected with Egyptian ideas about renewal and life. The Egyptians also developed beliefs about death and what happened afterward. They believed that some part of a person could continue to exist after death. Because of this, the treatment of the dead became increasingly important. Bodies were buried carefully. Food and other offerings could be placed with the deceased. Rituals were performed for the dead over many centuries. These beliefs would lead to increasingly elaborate tombs and burial traditions. But the Great Pyramids were still far in the future. Egypt was only beginning to develop the traditions that would eventually make its civilization so distinctive. As the Egyptian state became more organized, its rulers gained access to greater resources. Stone could be quarried from different parts of the country. Materials could be transported along the Nile. Large groups of workers could be organized for major projects. Egyptian builders gradually became more skilled at working with stone. Early royal tombs were relatively simple compared with the monuments that would come later. But architects and craftsmen continued experimenting with new designs. Each generation could build upon the knowledge of the previous one. Eventually, these experiments would lead to enormous stone monuments. The most famous would be the pyramids, but it is important to remember that the pyramids were not created in isolation. They were the result of centuries of development. Behind them stood a society that had learned how to farm on a large scale, organize workers, transport heavy materials, record information, and coordinate enormous construction projects. The Nile had helped make all of this possible, and the civilization surrounding the river was becoming increasingly powerful. For the people living in Egypt, however, daily life remained much more ordinary than the monuments might suggest. A farmer could spend most of the day working in the fields. A fisherman might spend hours along the river. A craftsman could work with wood, stone, leather, or clay. A weaver could produce linen cloth. A boatman could transport goods from one settlement to another. Children grew up surrounded by the same river, fields, animals, and desert landscapes that their parents had known at the end of the day. Families returned to their homes. The temperature gradually became cooler. The sun disappeared beyond the western desert, and the Nile continued flowing quietly through the darkness. Generations came and went, but the basic rhythm of life remained remarkably stable. The river rose, the fields were planted, the crops grew, the harvest arrived, and the cycle began again. Meanwhile, Egypt's rulers were preparing for something much larger. The early Egyptian kingdom would eventually develop into what historians call the Old Kingdom. This period would become famous for enormous royal monuments, powerful kings, and the construction of the Great Pyramids. But before those monuments appeared, Egypt had already accomplished something extraordinary. A large population had been brought together along a single river. Agriculture supported permanent communities. Trade connected distant regions. Writing allowed information to be preserved. Government organized resources. Religion provided a shared understanding of the world. And generations of craftsmen developed increasingly sophisticated skills. All of these developments had taken centuries. Nothing had appeared overnight. The pyramids would eventually rise from the desert. But their story began much earlier with small settlements beside the Nile. And so, as the river continued its slow journey toward the Mediterranean, Egypt entered a new age. The age of the great kings was approaching, and soon enormous monuments would begin to transform the desert forever. By the beginning of the Old Kingdom, Egypt had already developed many of the foundations that would support its civilization for centuries. The Nile continued to provide food and transportation. Farmers continued to cultivate the fertile land. Scribes recorded information for the growing administration. And the king stood at the center of Egyptian political and religious life. The rulers of this period would become some of the most famous kings in ancient history. They belonged to a series of dynasties that ruled Egypt for centuries. During this time, the Egyptian state became increasingly organized, and its ability to construct enormous monuments reached a level that had never been seen before. One of the earliest major steps toward the pyramid was taken during the reign of King Djoser. Djoser ruled during the Third Dynasty, more than 4,000 years ago. His most famous monument was built at Saqqara, not far from the ancient city of Memphis. It was the Step Pyramid. Unlike the later smooth-sided pyramids, the Step Pyramid consisted of several levels rising one above another. It represented a major development in Egyptian architecture. And behind its construction stood one of the most remarkable figures of the early Egyptian kingdom, the architect Imhotep. Imhotep is remembered as the architect associated with Djoser's Step Pyramid. The monument was constructed primarily from stone, something that represented a major change from the earlier traditions of royal burial. Before this period, many structures had relied heavily on mud brick. Stone had been used before, but the scale of the Step Pyramid complex was extraordinary. The pyramid itself rose above a large ceremonial complex surrounded by walls and other structures. The builders had to quarry stone, transport it, shape it, and position it carefully. There were no modern cranes or engines. Instead, ancient workers relied on human labor, wooden tools, ropes, sledges, ramps, and careful organization. The construction of such a monument required thousands of people working in different roles. Some quarried stone, others transported materials, some prepared food for the workers. Craftsmen shaped and finished the stone. Administrators recorded supplies and organized labor. The monument, therefore, represented more than the power of one king. It demonstrated the organizational ability of the Egyptian state. The Step Pyramid would influence the development of Egyptian royal architecture for generations. And eventually, Egyptian builders would create monuments far larger than Djoser's pyramid. After Djoser's reign, Egyptian rulers continued experimenting with pyramid construction. One important ruler was Sneferu, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty. Sneferu became one of the most productive pyramid builders in Egyptian history. His reign was associated with several major pyramid projects. One of them was the Medum Pyramid. It appears to have begun as a stepped structure and was later modified in an attempt to create smooth outer sides. The monument did not survive in the perfect form its builders intended. But the experiments were valuable. Egyptian architects were learning. They were discovering how to support enormous amounts of stone. They were experimenting with angles, foundations, and construction methods. Then came another remarkable structure. The bent pyramid at Djoser. Its lower section has a relatively steep angle, while the upper section changes to a shallower angle. The unusual shape suggests that the builders encountered problems during construction and adjusted their design. Rather than being a failure, the pyramid represents something important. Ancient Egyptian architecture was developing through experimentation. Each monument provided lessons for the next. Sneferu's final major pyramid project at Djoser became known as the Red Pyramid. Unlike the bent pyramid, the Red Pyramid has a more consistent shape. Its sides rise in a regular slope toward the top. It is considered one of the earliest successful examples of the true pyramid form. The experience gained during Sneferu's reign would soon be applied on an even greater scale. Sneferu's son was Khufu. He would become the ruler responsible for the largest and most famous pyramid in Egypt. The Great Pyramid at Giza. The construction of the Great Pyramid marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary building projects in ancient history. Its original height was approximately 146 meters. For thousands of years, it remained the tallest human-made structure in the world. Millions of stone blocks were used in its construction. Many of these blocks were extremely heavy. Yet the builders managed to transport them, position them, and create an enormous structure with remarkable precision. The Great Pyramid was not built in a single year. It was the result of years of planning, labor, transportation, and organization. The Great Pyramid was constructed on the Giza Plateau, west of the Nile. The location was carefully chosen. The plateau provided stable ground for the enormous structure, while the nearby river and its channels helped with transportation. Stone could be moved toward the construction area by boat. From there, workers could transport the blocks across the land. The exact methods used to raise every block remain a subject of discussion among historians and archaeologists. But there is no need to imagine that the Egyptians possessed mysterious technology. They had something else: organization. They understood mathematics. They could measure distances and angles. They could coordinate large numbers of workers, and they had generations of experience working with stone. The people building the pyramid were not simply wandering laborers. Many were skilled workers. Others were farmers who may have worked on state projects during periods when agricultural labor was less demanding. Workers needed food, shelter, clothing, tools, and medical care. Large construction projects therefore created entire communities of support. Behind the pyramid was a complex system of people working together. The Great Pyramid was built as the tomb of King Khufu. For the ancient Egyptians, a royal tomb was more than a place to bury a body. It was part of a much larger religious system. The king was believed to have an important connection with the gods. After death, the king's existence was expected to continue in another form. The pyramid and surrounding structures were designed to support this transition. Temples were constructed near the pyramids. Priests performed rituals. Offerings were provided. Food and other supplies were brought to support the deceased king's cult. The entire complex was therefore a place of religious activity. The pyramid itself was only one part of a much larger landscape. Around it were temples, causeways, smaller pyramids, tombs, and other structures. The Giza Plateau gradually became a vast royal cemetery, and while the pyramids were built for kings, many other people were buried nearby: officials, craftsmen, members of royal families, and other important individuals had their own tombs. The landscape became a city of the dead. Khufu's son, Jedefah, ruled for a relatively short period, and after him came Kaffa. Kaffa is associated with the second Great Pyramid at Giza. Although it is slightly smaller than Khufu's pyramid, its position on higher ground can make it appear almost as tall. Kaffa's complex also included a massive stone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king. This monument is now commonly known as the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx rests near the pyramids and has watched over the Giza Plateau for thousands of years. Its original purpose and many details of its history have been debated. But its connection with royal power is clear. The lion was associated with strength and protection. The human face represented intelligence and kingship. Together, the image created a powerful symbol of royal authority. The Sphinx and pyramids formed part of a carefully designed ceremonial landscape. They were meant to endure long after the people who built them were gone. Kaffa was followed by another ruler of the 4th dynasty, Menkaure. His pyramid at Giza is considerably smaller than those of Khufu and Kaffa. Yet the monument was still an enormous undertaking. Its lower sections used large blocks of stone, and some areas incorporated granite transported from distant parts of Egypt. Granite was harder to work than limestone. Moving such material required planning and considerable effort. By this point, The Giza Plateau had become one of the most impressive royal landscapes in the ancient world, but Egypt itself was much larger than the monuments of Giza. Thousands of villages stretched along the Nile. Farmers continued growing crops, fishermen worked along the river. Merchants travelled between settlements, craftsmen produced tools, pottery, jewellery, furniture, and clothing. The pyramids occupied only a small part of Egyptian life. Most people never lived inside a pyramid complex. Their world was the river, the fields, their homes, and their local communities. Life during the Old Kingdom was highly organized. But it was not necessarily easy. Farmers depended on the Nile and the success of their crops. A poor harvest could create difficulties for entire communities. Workers depended on supplies of food and other necessities. Officials were responsible for collecting and distributing resources. The Egyptian government, therefore, had to maintain an enormous network of administration. Scribes were especially important because most people could not read or write. Scribes held specialized positions. They recorded taxes, they counted livestock, they measured fields, they documented supplies. They wrote letters and administrative records. Writing allowed information to move through the government without depending entirely on memory. It also preserved religious texts, names, titles, and records of important events. Over time, Egyptian writing would become one of the most recognizable writing systems of the ancient world. Its symbols would later be carved into the walls of temples and tombs across Egypt. The Old Kingdom continued for centuries. The Great Pyramids remained symbols of royal authority, but eventually the power of the central government began to weaken. One reason was the growing influence of local officials and provincial governors. Egypt was divided into administrative regions. Each region had its own officials and communities. Over time, some local leaders became increasingly powerful, at the same time maintaining royal monuments. Religious institutions and government administration required enormous resources. The central state had to continue collecting and distributing food. It had to support officials. It had to maintain temples, and it had to preserve the authority of the king. Eventually, the balance began to change. The power of local rulers increased. The Old Kingdom gradually came to an end. The Great Pyramid Age was fading. But Egyptian civilization itself was far from disappearing. The Nile continued to flow. The villages remained. The language and traditions survived. And after a period of political division and uncertainty, Egypt would eventually reunite. A new chapter of Egyptian history was waiting beyond the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom had left behind some of the most extraordinary monuments of the ancient world. The pyramids still stood beside the desert, the temples continued to receive offerings, and the Nile continued to flow through the center of Egyptian life. But the political system that had organized Egypt for centuries was changing. The authority of the kings weakened, while local officials and provincial governors became more powerful. Egypt gradually entered a period that historians call the First Intermediate Period. It lasted for several generations and was marked by political division instead of one strong central government controlling the entire country. Different regions increasingly operated under their own local leaders. The change did not mean that Egyptian civilization suddenly disappeared. People still lived beside the Nile. Farmers continued cultivating their fields. Craftsmen continued producing pottery, tools, jewelry, and clothing. Religious traditions continued. Writing continued. The pyramids and temples remained part of the landscape, but political power had become divided. In some regions, local rulers gained authority over their communities and began acting more independently from the royal court. The country that had once been strongly centralized was becoming more fragmented. And yet, even during this uncertain period, Egyptian culture continued to develop. The first intermediate period was not simply a time of chaos for ordinary Egyptians. Daily life continued, villages remained active, farmers worked the fields, fishermen travelled along the Nile. Merchants exchanged goods between communities. Families continued to raise children and maintain their homes. The difference was that political authority was no longer concentrated as strongly in one place. Local rulers could collect taxes, organize workers, and maintain their own administrations. Some provincial families became wealthy and powerful. Their tombs became increasingly elaborate, showing that important people outside the royal court could now display considerable status. Egypt was beginning to develop a stronger regional character. Different areas had their own leaders, traditions, and political interests. But the Nile still connected them. People continued traveling along the river. Goods continued moving between settlements, and the shared language, religion, and customs of Egypt remained powerful forces holding the civilization together. Eventually, competition between regional powers would lead to a struggle for control of the entire country. The south and north would once again become the centers of rival political authority. One of the most important centers of power was Thebes in Upper Egypt. The city had existed for centuries, but during the first intermediate period, its rulers became increasingly influential farther north. Another center of power emerged around Heraclepolis. The rulers of these regions competed for control of Egypt. The conflict was not necessarily one continuous war. Instead, political power shifted over time. Alliances formed, rulers gained territory, others lost influence, and throughout the country, local officials continued governing their communities. Eventually, a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II would play a decisive role in reunifying Egypt. Mentuhotep belonged to the dynasty that would establish what historians call the Middle Kingdom. His rise marked a major turning point. After generations of political division, Egypt was once again brought under centralized rule. The reunification of Egypt did not erase everything that had happened during the first intermediate period. The country had changed. Local officials had gained experience and influence. Regional identities had become stronger. And the new rulers understood that maintaining unity would require careful administration. The Middle Kingdom would therefore become an important period of political reconstruction. The Middle Kingdom is often remembered as a period of stability, prosperity, and cultural development. Egyptian rulers strengthened the central government and worked to restore control over the provinces. Officials were appointed to manage different regions. Taxes and agricultural production were organized. The military became more important, especially along Egypt's southern and eastern borders. The rulers of the Middle Kingdom also invested in irrigation and agricultural projects. The Nile remained the foundation of Egyptian prosperity. But people continued finding ways to make better use of its waters. Canals and irrigation systems helped distribute water to agricultural areas. Farmers could grow crops in regions that depended heavily on controlled water supplies. Food production supported the growing population and the administration of the kingdom. The government also became interested in resources beyond the Nile Valley. Egypt had access to valuable stone, minerals, and other materials in the surrounding deserts. Expeditions were organized to obtain them. The Middle Kingdom was therefore not only a period of rebuilding, it was a period of expansion and renewed confidence. One of the most important regions for Egypt was Nubia. South of the traditional Egyptian heartland, the Nile connected Egypt with Nubia. But the relationship between the two regions could be complicated. Nubia contained valuable resources, including gold. It also controlled important routes farther south. Egyptian rulers therefore wanted to maintain influence in the region. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian armies and officials established a stronger presence in parts of Nubia. Fortresses were constructed along the Nile, These buildings served several purposes. They protected important routes, they monitored movement along the river, and they helped Egypt maintain control over valuable resources. The fortresses could be large and heavily built. With thick walls, towers, gates, and storage areas, they represented the growing military organization of the Middle Kingdom. But Egypt's influence did not stop with military power. Trade also connected Egypt with neighboring regions. Goods, animals, minerals, and luxury products moved along routes through northeastern Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The Middle Kingdom was becoming an increasingly connected society. The prosperity of the Middle Kingdom also influenced Egyptian culture. Literature became especially important. Scribes produced stories, teachings, poems, and official records. Some of these works survived because they were copied and preserved by later generations. Egyptian artists also created sculptures that were sometimes more realistic than the idealized royal images of earlier periods. Statues of Middle Kingdom rulers could show serious expressions and thoughtful faces. These images may have reflected changing ideas about kingship. The king was still presented as powerful and connected to the gods. But royal art could also emphasize the responsibilities and difficulties of ruling. Architecture continued to develop as well. Kings built temples, monuments, fortresses, and burial complexes. The pyramids did not disappear completely. However, the style and organization of royal monuments changed. The Great Pyramids of Giza belonged to an earlier age. Middle Kingdom rulers built their own monuments. But they also placed greater emphasis on temples and other architectural complexes. Egyptian civilization was continuing to evolve. For ordinary Egyptians, the Middle Kingdom was still a world of farming and seasonal work. A farmer's life remained closely connected to the Nile. Fields had to be prepared, crops had to be planted, animals needed to be cared for, and harvested grain had to be stored in villages. Families lived in houses made largely from mud brick. Food was prepared using simple ovens and household tools. Bread and beer were important parts of the Egyptian diet. Fish, vegetables, fruits, and other foods were also available depending on location and social position. Craftsmen produced objects used by ordinary families as well as wealthy households. Potters shaped clay vessels, weavers produced linen, carpenters made furniture and tools, metalworkers created weapons, jewelry, and other objects. Although Egyptian society was highly unequal, it was supported by the work of millions of people whose names were rarely recorded. Their daily labor kept the kingdom functioning. The Middle Kingdom continued for several centuries. The central government remained powerful, but maintaining a large kingdom was never easy. Egyptian rulers had to manage the provinces, protect borders, control trade routes, and maintain agricultural production. They also had to preserve the traditional authority of the king. Over time, political changes once again began to appear. Later Middle Kingdom rulers faced increasing challenges. Eventually, the central government weakened. Egypt entered another period of political instability. The Middle Kingdom came to an end, yet once again. Egyptian civilization survived, the temples remained, the language continued. The traditions of writing and religion were passed down, the Nile continued to support agriculture, and the people of Egypt continued living along its banks. The country would soon experience another period of foreign influence and political division. This next chapter would introduce Egypt to a group of people whose origins and identity have been debated for centuries. They would become known as the Hyksos, and their arrival would change Egyptian history. The Hyksos eventually established control over much of northern Egypt. Their rise took place during what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. They were not simply an invading army that appeared suddenly and conquered the entire country. Their presence in Egypt developed over time. People from the eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia had been entering Egypt for generations. Some came as merchants, others came as workers, soldiers, or settlers. Eventually, political circumstances allowed leaders associated with these foreign communities to establish power in the north. The Hyksos ruled from the city of Avaris in the eastern Nile Delta. They adopted many Egyptian customs. They used Egyptian administrative practices. They interacted with Egyptian society. And their rulers adopted aspects of Egyptian kingship at the same time. They introduced or helped spread technologies and military practices that would become increasingly important. Among these were improved use of the horse-drawn chariot and certain types of bronze weapons. Egyptian rulers in the south watched the growing power of the Hyksos. Eventually, resistance began to form. The conflict between the rulers of southern Egypt and the Hyksos would continue for generations. The Theban royal family became the center of Egyptian resistance. One of the early rulers involved was Seqenen Adao. His reign appears to have been connected with the struggle against Hyksos power. After him came other Theban rulers who continued the conflict. Eventually, a king named Ahmose I would complete the reunification of Egypt. Ahmose captured Avaris and pushed Hyksos forces out of Egypt. He then continued campaigns into neighboring regions to secure Egypt's borders. His victory marked the beginning of the 18th dynasty. It also marked the beginning of what historians call the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom would become one of the most powerful periods in Egyptian history. Its rulers would expand Egyptian influence far beyond the traditional Nile Valley. Huge temples would be built. Wealth would flow into Egypt. And some of the most famous pharaohs in history would rule the country. But before that new age began, Egypt had passed through centuries of change. The age of the pyramids was long gone. The country had experienced division, reunification, prosperity, and foreign rule. Through all of it, the Nile continued flowing, and beside that ancient river, Egyptian civilization continued its long journey through time. The victory of Ahmose I changed the course of Egyptian history. After generations of political division and foreign rule in the north, Egypt was once again united under a single king. Ahmose became the founder of the 18th dynasty, and with his reign began what historians call the New Kingdom. This would become one of the most powerful periods in the history of ancient Egypt. The kings of the New Kingdom ruled over a wealthy and increasingly powerful state. Egyptian armies moved beyond the traditional borders of the Nile Valley. Trade expanded. Gold and other valuable resources flowed into the kingdom. And enormous temples were constructed to honor the gods and the kings. But the New Kingdom was not created from nothing. Its rulers had learned from the political struggles of earlier centuries. They understood that Egypt's security depended on controlling its borders. The experience of the Hyksos had also changed Egyptian military organization. Egyptian armies became more experienced with chariots, improved weapons, and organized campaigns. The country was now preparing to become an empire. Ahmose I spent much of his reign strengthening the kingdom he had inherited. The Hyksos had been expelled from Egypt, but their defeat did not end the dangers surrounding the country. To the south lay Nubia, a region rich in gold and strategically important to Egypt. To the northeast were the lands of the Levant, where different kingdoms and city-states competed for influence. Ahmose's armies therefore moved beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Campaigns were launched into Nubia. Egyptian forces also pushed northward into the Levant. These campaigns helped establish a defensive zone around Egypt. The goal was not simply conquest. The rulers wanted to prevent powerful enemies from approaching the Nile Valley. Egypt's geography had always provided some protection. The deserts limited movement from many directions. But the New Kingdom kings understood that waiting for enemies to reach Egypt was dangerous. Instead, they increasingly preferred to confront threats far from the Nile. This strategy would help Egypt become one of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East. After Ahmose, the rulers of the 18th dynasty continued expanding Egyptian influence. One of the most important rulers was Thutmose I during his reign. Egyptian armies advanced deep into Nubia and expanded Egyptian control in the Levant. The king's authority now reached far beyond the traditional Egyptian heartland. Egyptian officials were appointed to administer conquered territories. Tribute was collected from foreign rulers: gold, precious materials, animals, timber, and other goods entered Egypt. The wealth helped support the royal court, the military, and enormous building projects. The new kingdom, Pharaoh, was becoming more than simply the ruler of the Nile Valley. He was presented as a powerful king whose authority extended across foreign lands. Monuments recorded military victories. Temple walls showed conquered peoples bringing tribute, and royal inscriptions celebrated the strength of Egypt's armies. Yet behind these images was a complicated political system. Egypt could not directly control every village and city in its growing sphere of influence. Instead, local rulers often remained in power as long as they recognized Egyptian authority and provided tribute. Egypt had become an imperial power. One of the most unusual rulers of this period was a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut belonged to the royal family and eventually became pharaoh. Her rise was unusual because Egyptian kingship was normally associated with male rulers. Yet Hatshepsut successfully presented herself as a legitimate king. She adopted traditional royal imagery. Statues showed her wearing the symbols of kingship. In some representations, she even appeared with the traditional false beard associated with pharaohs. But Hatshepsut's reign was not defined only by royal symbolism. She focused heavily on trade, construction, and economic development. One of her most famous achievements was an expedition to the distant land of Punt. Egyptian ships traveled southward along the Red Sea. They returned carrying valuable goods, including incense, exotic plants, animals, and other materials. Hatshepsut also sponsored enormous construction projects. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari became one of the most distinctive monuments of the new kingdom. Its terraces rose dramatically against the cliffs of western Thebes. After Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt entered another period of military expansion. Thutmose III became one of the most successful military rulers of ancient Egypt. He led numerous campaigns into the Levant. One of the best-known battles occurred at Megiddo. Egyptian forces faced a coalition of local rulers who had rebelled against Egyptian authority. Thutmose chose a dangerous route through a narrow mountain pass. His army emerged unexpectedly near Megiddo. The Egyptian victory strengthened his control over the region. Later campaigns pushed Egyptian influence even farther north. Thutmose III also continued military operations in Nubia. His reign demonstrated the military power that the new kingdom had developed. Egypt now possessed organized infantry, chariots, experienced commanders, and a government capable of supporting long-distance campaigns. The wealth gained through empire helped finance temples and monuments. Egypt was becoming richer, but maintaining an empire required constant military attention. The lands of the Levant were never completely peaceful. Rebellions could occur whenever Egyptian forces withdrew. The pharaoh, therefore, had to remain both a ruler and a military commander. The wealth of the new kingdom transformed Egyptian religion and architecture. Temples became enormous institutions. They were not simply places where people came to pray. They owned land. They employed workers. They stored grain. They controlled animals and workshops, and they could become extremely wealthy. The most important religious center was Thebes. There, the god Amun became one of the most powerful deities in Egypt. The temple complex at Karnak expanded over generations. Kings added new halls, columns, statues, obelisks, and courtyards. The result was an enormous sacred complex that reflected the growing power of both the pharaohs and the priesthood. Across Egypt, temples served as economic centers as well as religious institutions. Priests performed rituals according to ancient traditions. Offerings were presented to the gods. Scribes recorded supplies. Workers maintained buildings and produced goods. Religion was deeply connected to the economy and government of New Kingdom Egypt. The New Kingdom also produced some of Egypt's most famous royal tombs, instead of concentrating royal burials in enormous pyramids. New Kingdom pharaohs were generally buried in hidden tombs carved into the cliffs of the western Theban Desert. The most famous burial ground became known as the Valley of the Kings. The location offered protection from the open desert and allowed tombs to be hidden within the mountains. Workers carved long corridors and chambers into the rock. The walls were covered with painted scenes and religious texts. These decorations were intended to help the deceased king travel safely into the afterlife. The tombs could contain burial equipment, statues, furniture, jewelry, and other objects. Many were eventually robbed, but some survived for centuries. The Valley of the Kings would later become one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. Its tombs provide an extraordinary record of New Kingdom beliefs, art, and royal life. Among the rulers buried in this region was Amenhotep III. His reign was a period of enormous wealth and artistic achievement. Amenhotep III built temples, statues, palaces, and monuments throughout Egypt. His enormous stone statues, later known as the Colossi of Memnon, stood near his mortuary temple on the western bank of the Nile. The royal court became increasingly wealthy. Diplomatic relationships connected Egypt with other powerful kingdoms. Letters written on clay tablets reveal communication between Egyptian rulers and kings of foreign states. These rulers exchanged gifts and discussed marriage alliances, trade, military concerns, and political disputes. Egypt was now part of a larger international world. The pharaohs were communicating with rulers from regions as far away as Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The New Kingdom was no longer an isolated civilization. It was one of several great powers competing for influence across the ancient Near East. And then Egypt experienced one of the most dramatic religious transformations in its history. Amenhotep IV became pharaoh and later changed his name to Akhenaten. He introduced a radically different approach to Egyptian religion instead of emphasizing the traditional pantheon. Akhenaten promoted the Aten, represented as the visible disk of the sun. He built a new capital city called Akhenaten. Today, the site is known as Amarna. The artistic style of the period also changed. Royal figures were represented in unusual ways, with more elongated forms, and scenes showing the royal family in intimate settings. Akhenaten's religious reforms challenged powerful traditions. Temples dedicated to older gods lost influence. The traditional priesthood, especially the priests of Amen, was weakened, but the changes did not last after Akhenaten's death. Egypt gradually returned to traditional religious practices. His city was abandoned, his successors restored the old gods, and the name of Akhenaten was later removed from many monuments. The experiment had been extraordinary. But Egyptian society eventually returned to the religious traditions that had shaped it for centuries. After Akhenaten's death, a young king came to the throne. His name was Tutankhaten. He later changed his name to Tutankhamun. Reflecting the restoration of the traditional god Amen, Tutankhamun ruled for only a short time. He was probably still a child when he became pharaoh. His reign was not particularly important for military conquest or imperial expansion. Yet thousands of years later, his name would become famous around the world. The reason was his tomb. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike many royal tombs, it had escaped complete robbery. Inside were thousands of objects. There were statues, chariots, furniture, jewelry, weapons, clothing, and ceremonial objects. And among the treasures was the famous golden burial mask of the young king. The discovery transformed public interest in ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun himself had been a relatively minor ruler, but the survival of his tomb made him one of the most recognizable pharaohs in history. After Tutankhamun, Egypt continued under rulers who sought to restore stability. The 19th dynasty eventually brought some of the most famous pharaohs of the new kingdom. Among them was Seti I. He restored Egyptian monuments and launched military campaigns to strengthen Egypt's position in the Levant. His son would become even more famous. His name was Ramesses II. Ramesses ruled for more than 6 decades. His reign became one of the longest and most celebrated in Egyptian history. He built enormous monuments across Egypt. Statues of the king were placed in temples. His name was carved into countless walls. And he presented himself as a great military conqueror. One of the most famous events of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh. Egyptian forces fought the Hittite Empire in a major confrontation in the Levant. The battle was not a simple Egyptian victory. Both sides eventually negotiated. Years later, Egypt and the Hittites agreed to one of the earliest known international peace treaties in history. Ramesses II continued building throughout his long reign. One of his most famous monuments was the temple complex at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. For enormous seated statues of the king were carved directly into the rock outside the temple. Inside, massive halls and chambers were decorated with scenes of the pharaoh, the gods, and his military achievements. Ramesses also expanded temples at places such as Karnak and Luxor. His monuments were intended to survive for generations. They celebrated the king's power and his relationship with the gods. But behind the monuments was an enormous administrative system. Thousands of workers, craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, scribes, priests, and officials supported the kingdom. Grain had to be collected. Ships had to be supplied. Buildings required stone. Armies needed weapons and food. Temples required workers and offerings. The greatness of the new kingdom depended on this enormous network of people. The pharaoh stood at its center, but the civilization itself was maintained by countless ordinary people whose names have mostly disappeared from history. After the long reign of Ramesses II, Egypt remained powerful, but new challenges were approaching. The eastern Mediterranean was becoming increasingly unstable. Kingdoms and cities were attacked. Trade routes were disrupted. Populations moved across the region. One group became especially famous in Egyptian records. They were known as the Sea Peoples. Their exact origins remain debated. They appear to have been a collection of different groups moving through the eastern Mediterranean during a period of widespread instability. Egyptian rulers faced them during the reign of Ramesses III. The Egyptian army and navy fought major battles against them. Egypt claimed victory, but the wider regional crisis continued. Many civilizations around the eastern Mediterranean experienced destruction or political collapse. Egypt survived, yet surviving did not mean remaining as powerful as before. The New Kingdom was beginning to weaken. During the later New Kingdom, Egypt faced growing economic and political problems. The enormous temples had become extremely wealthy. The priesthood of Amun in Thebes gained considerable influence. At the same time, the central government struggled with expenses. Military campaigns required resources. Temple institutions required food and workers. The administration of the kingdom became increasingly difficult to maintain. Eventually, political power became divided. High priests and regional officials gained greater independence. The pharaoh's authority weakened. The new kingdom slowly came to an end. The period had lasted for centuries. It had produced some of Egypt's greatest monuments and most famous rulers. It had transformed Egypt into an international power. But like the old kingdom before it, The new kingdom eventually lost the political unity that had supported its greatness. Egypt would enter another period of division. Yet Egyptian civilization itself would continue. The Nile still flowed. The temples still stood. The ancient traditions survived, and the history of Egypt was far from finished. The new kingdom had been one of the greatest periods in Egyptian history. For centuries, Egypt had possessed powerful armies, enormous temples, wealthy institutions, and influence across much of the eastern Mediterranean. But by the end of the 20th dynasty, that power was beginning to weaken. The central government struggled to control the country. The economy faced increasing pressure. The great temples had accumulated enormous wealth, while the authority of the pharaoh was becoming less certain. After the death of Ramesses XI, the political structure of Egypt changed dramatically. The period that followed is known as the Third Intermediate Period. It lasted for several centuries and was marked by political division, competing rulers, foreign influence, and changing centers of power. Egypt was no longer controlled by one strong pharaoh in the way it had been during the height of the new kingdom. Instead, different regions and powerful families began to control parts of the country. Yet, the ancient traditions of Egypt did not disappear. The temples remained active. The priests continued their rituals. Farmers still worked along the Nile, and Egyptian civilization continued adapting to a changing world. One of the most powerful figures in the early Third Intermediate Period was the high priest of Amun at Thebes. The priesthood had become enormously wealthy during the New Kingdom. Its temples controlled land, livestock, workshops, grain, and thousands of workers. This wealth gave the priests considerable political influence. In Upper Egypt, the high priests of Amun could exercise authority almost like independent rulers. Far to the north, the kings continued to rule from the Nile Delta. The result was a divided Egypt. The south was dominated by the powerful priesthood centered at Thebes. The north remained under the authority of kings and their administrations. There was still a shared Egyptian culture. People continued to worship the traditional gods. Scribes continued writing in the ancient Egyptian language. And temples continued to preserve traditions that were already thousands of years old. But political unity had become much weaker. Egypt had entered another period in which regional power was more important than the authority of a single ruler. During the Third Intermediate Period, a new group became increasingly important in Egyptian politics. These were the Libyan peoples who had been entering Egypt for generations. Some had originally arrived as soldiers serving in the Egyptian army. Others settled in communities within the Nile Delta. Over time, powerful Libyan families accumulated land and political influence. Eventually, one of these families established a dynasty of its own. This became the 22nd dynasty. Its founder was a ruler named Shoshenq I. Shoshenq was not simply a local chief. He presented himself as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh. He adopted traditional royal titles and continued the customs of earlier dynasties. He also sought to restore Egyptian influence abroad. One of his most famous campaigns took him into the Levant. His forces attacked several cities and kingdoms in the region. The campaign demonstrated that Egypt, despite its political divisions, could still project military power beyond its borders, but the unity of the country remained fragile. Shoshenq I is especially interesting because his campaign in the Levant is also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Egyptian inscriptions record his victories. They describe cities and territories that his army encountered during the campaign. The campaign shows that Egypt was still connected to the wider political world of the ancient Near East. But after Shoshenq's reign, Egypt became increasingly divided. Different Libyan dynasties appeared. Local rulers competed with one another. The kings in the north did not always have effective control over Upper Egypt. At Thebes, the priesthood remained powerful. In some regions, local officials and military commanders gained authority over their own territories. The political map of Egypt was becoming complicated. There could be several competing royal centers at the same time, yet from the perspective of ordinary people. Life still revolved around the Nile. The annual flooding continued to provide water for agriculture. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, vegetables, and other crops villagers continued to grow. Markets remained active, and temples continued receiving offerings. Religion remained one of the strongest connections between the different parts of Egypt. The great gods of earlier periods were still worshipped. Amun remained especially important at Thebes. Osiris continued to be associated with death and the afterlife. Isis, Horus, Ra, and many other gods remained central to Egyptian religious life. The temples preserved ancient rituals and traditions. Priests performed ceremonies according to practices that had been passed down for generations. Egyptians continued to prepare carefully for death. Mummies were created. Tombs were decorated. Funerary objects were placed with the dead. The belief in an afterlife remained deeply important in many ways. The Third Intermediate Period demonstrates how cultural traditions can survive even when political systems change. The kings might change, dynasties might rise and disappear. Foreign peoples might gain influence, but the religious and cultural traditions of Egypt remained remarkably persistent. The political situation became even more complicated during the 8th century BCE. A powerful kingdom was developing far to the south. It was centered in Nubia in the region of Kush. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia had changed many times throughout history. Sometimes Egypt had controlled Nubian territory. At other times, Nubian kingdoms had been independent. Now Kush had become a major power in its own right. Its rulers adopted many Egyptian traditions. They worshipped Egyptian gods, they used Egyptian royal titles, and they viewed themselves as heirs to the ancient traditions of the pharaohs. The Kushite king Pi eventually turned his attention northward. Egypt was divided among several rulers. Pi believed that restoring order under his authority was both a political and religious mission. His armies marched north into Egypt. One by one, several Egyptian rulers submitted to him. Pi eventually gained control over much of the country. A Nubian dynasty had entered the history of Egypt. The Kushite rulers became Egypt's 25th dynasty. They ruled both Egypt and their homeland in Nubia. Their kings presented themselves as traditional Egyptian pharaohs. They built temples. They restored religious monuments. They honored the ancient gods. And they constructed pyramids in Nubia, continuing a tradition that had begun thousands of years earlier. But the Kushite rulers faced a powerful enemy to the northeast. The Assyrian Empire was expanding rapidly. The Assyrians had built one of the most powerful military states of the ancient Near East. Their armies conquered territories across Mesopotamia and the Levant. Eventually, Assyria became involved in Egyptian affairs. The Kushite pharaohs supported resistance against Assyrian influence. This brought Egypt into direct conflict with the Assyrian Empire. The struggle would prove extremely difficult. Egypt was about to face one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world. The Assyrians invaded Egypt during the reign of the Kushite pharaoh Taharqa. Their armies moved through the Levant and into Egypt. The conflict was intense. The Assyrians captured important Egyptian cities and forced Taharqa to retreat southward. For a time, the Kushite rulers attempted to recover their lost territory, but Assyria continued to intervene. Eventually, the Kushites were pushed out of Egypt. Their rule over the country had lasted only a few decades, yet their influence remained important. The Kushite pharaohs had restored many ancient monuments. They had continued Egyptian religious traditions. And they demonstrated that Nubia was not simply a region controlled by Egypt. It had its own powerful civilization capable of ruling Egypt itself. After the Kushites withdrew, Egypt entered another phase of political change. A new dynasty would emerge in the north, and once again, Egypt would attempt to restore unity. The new rulers belonged to the 26th dynasty. Its most important early ruler was Psamtik I. He came to power during a period when the great empires surrounding Egypt were changing. Assyria was weakening. Its enemies were becoming stronger. This created an opportunity for Egypt. Psamtik gradually restored control over the country. He brought different regions under his authority. He also strengthened Egypt's connections with the Mediterranean world. Greek merchants and soldiers became increasingly present in Egypt. Greek communities developed in places such as Naucratis in the Nile Delta. Trade expanded across the Mediterranean. Egyptian goods moved outward. Foreign products entered the Nile Valley. The country was becoming more connected to the wider Mediterranean economy. Egypt was no longer the dominant empire it had once been during the New Kingdom, but it remained an important kingdom. Its ancient culture continued to attract foreign visitors, merchants, soldiers, and rulers. The rulers of the 26th dynasty are sometimes associated with an Egyptian cultural revival. They looked back toward the great periods of the past. Ancient artistic styles were revived. Old religious traditions were strengthened, temples were restored, monuments were repaired. The pharaohs presented themselves as heirs to the rulers of earlier ages. This interest in Egypt's own past was especially important because the country was now surrounded by powerful foreign civilizations. Greek cities were expanding. The Persian Empire was growing. Mediterranean trade networks were becoming increasingly important. Egypt had to navigate a changing political world. For a time, the country remained independent. Egyptian armies fought abroad. Trade brought wealth into the Nile Valley. And the temples continued their ancient rituals. But the independence of Egypt would not last forever. A new empire was rising to the east. The Persian Empire had become one of the largest states the ancient world had ever seen, and Egypt would soon become one of its targets. The Persian Empire had become one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Its territories stretched across much of Asia, from Central Asia to the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt had remained independent during the early years of Persian expansion, but that independence would not last. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses turned his attention toward Egypt. At the time, Egypt was ruled by Psamtik III, the final pharaoh of the 26th dynasty. The Egyptian and Persian armies met near the eastern border of Egypt. The Persians defeated the Egyptian forces. Cambyses entered Memphis and took control of the country. Egypt had become part of the Persian Empire. The conquest brought an end to the independence of the Saite kings. But the Persian rulers understood that controlling Egypt required more than military force. They adopted many Egyptian royal traditions. Cambyses presented himself as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh. Temples continued to function, priests continued their ceremonies, and Egyptian religious traditions remained part of daily life. Egypt became a province of the enormous Persian Empire. The Persian king was now the highest authority. But much of the existing Egyptian administration remained in place. Local officials continued managing villages and agricultural areas. Scribes continued keeping records. Farmers continued cultivating the fields beside the Nile. The Persian rulers also relied on Egypt's enormous agricultural resources. Grain from the Nile Valley could support armies and cities throughout the empire. Egypt was therefore valuable not only because of its ancient culture, but also because of its wealth and strategic position. Persian governors were appointed to administer the country. Some Egyptian nobles and priests continued to hold influence. The temples remained important institutions, but Persian rule was not always peaceful. Egyptians occasionally rebelled against the empire. Several revolts occurred during the following centuries. At different times, Egyptian leaders briefly succeeded in restoring independence. But Persia repeatedly returned to reassert its authority. Egyptian resistance became especially important during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Persian control was sometimes weakened by conflicts elsewhere in the empire. Egyptian rulers used these opportunities to challenge Persian authority for periods of time. Independent Egyptian dynasties returned to power. The 28th dynasty lasted only briefly. It was followed by the 29th and 30th dynasties. These rulers attempted to preserve Egypt's independence. The 30th dynasty became particularly successful. Its kings rebuilt temples and presented themselves as traditional pharaohs. They continued ancient religious ceremonies. They commissioned statues and monuments, and they attempted to strengthen the Egyptian military. But Egypt faced a difficult political environment. The Persian Empire remained powerful. Meanwhile, Greek states and cities were becoming increasingly important across the Mediterranean. Egypt sometimes relied on Greek soldiers and mercenaries. The country stood between several competing worlds. Egyptian traditions remained ancient, but the political environment around the Nile was changing rapidly. The last native Egyptian pharaoh was Nectanebo II. He ruled during the 4th century BCE. Nectanebo was a strong supporter of Egyptian temples and religion. Under his rule, many temples were expanded or restored. He presented himself as a traditional Egyptian king. His monuments showed him making offerings to the gods. But Nectanebo faced a serious threat from the Persian Empire. The Persians attempted to reconquer Egypt. Their first major attempt failed. Nectanebo's forces successfully defended the country. For a time, Egypt remained independent, but the situation eventually changed. The Persian Empire reorganized its forces. A new invasion was launched. This time, the Egyptian defenses could not hold. Nectanebo was forced to retreat. He eventually fled southward. Egypt had once again fallen under Persian rule, and Nectanebo II became the last native Egyptian pharaoh to rule Egypt before the arrival of Alexander the Great. Persian rule over Egypt did not last forever. By the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire was facing increasing challenges. Greek states had become stronger. Macedon, under its king Philip II, was expanding rapidly. His son, Alexander, would soon inherit this growing power. Alexander was an ambitious military commander. He defeated the Persian Empire in a series of major campaigns. After conquering much of the Persian territory in Asia, Alexander moved toward Egypt. For the Egyptians, his arrival represented something different from another Persian conquest. Many Egyptians viewed the Macedonians as potential liberators from Persian rule. When Alexander entered Egypt in 330 BCE, Persian authority collapsed. He was welcomed into the country. He visited Memphis. He participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies. And he was presented according to Egyptian traditions as a legitimate ruler. But Alexander's stay in Egypt would be relatively brief. His armies were already moving across an enormous empire. Before leaving, he founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast. Its name would become famous throughout history. It was called Alexandria. Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE. The city was built on the Mediterranean coast. Near the western edge of the Nile Delta, its location was carefully chosen. It connected Egypt with the Mediterranean world. Ships could arrive from Greece and other regions. Goods could travel through Egypt and across the sea. Over time, Alexandria became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It attracted merchants, sailors, scholars, artists, and travelers. Its population became remarkably diverse. Egyptians lived alongside Greeks, Macedonians, Jews, and people from many other regions. The city also became famous for learning. Libraries and scholarly institutions developed there. Scientists studied mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and other subjects. Alexandria would eventually become one of the intellectual centers of the ancient Mediterranean. But Alexander himself would never see the city reach its full greatness. After leaving Egypt, he continued eastward. He conquered the Persian Empire and reached deep into Asia. Then, in 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon. His empire did not remain united. Instead, his generals fought over his territories. Egypt would become the center of one of their kingdoms. One of Alexander's generals was Ptolemy. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy took control of Egypt. He eventually established his own dynasty. This dynasty became known as the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They were of Macedonian Greek origin. Yet they understood the importance of Egyptian traditions. Like earlier foreign rulers, they adopted the title of pharaoh. They supported Egyptian temples. They made offerings to the ancient gods. And they commissioned monuments using traditional Egyptian artistic styles. At the same time, Greek culture became extremely influential. The royal court was centered in Alexandria. Greek became an important language of government and administration. Egyptian and Greek traditions existed side by side. This created a distinctive culture. Egypt was still ancient Egypt, but it was now deeply connected to the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world. And Alexandria was becoming the heart of this new kingdom. One of Alexandria's greatest achievements was its role as a center of knowledge. The Ptolemaic rulers supported scholars and collected written works from across the Mediterranean and Near East. The famous Library of Alexandria became associated with this effort. Its exact size and organization remain uncertain, but ancient sources describe a major intellectual institution where scholars could study and exchange ideas. Mathematicians worked there. Astronomers observed the heavens. Geographers attempted to understand the shape and size of the world. Physicians studied the human body. Writers and philosophers examined literature and history. One famous scholar was Eratosthenes. He calculated a remarkably accurate estimate of the Earth's circumference using geometry and observations of shadows. Other scholars studied the movement of planets and stars. Alexandria became a place where knowledge from different civilizations could meet. Egypt's ancient traditions were now interacting with Greek science and philosophy. The city had become one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Life in Ptolemaic Egypt was not the same for everyone. The countryside remained overwhelmingly Egyptian. Most farmers continued to live in villages along the Nile. They cultivated crops and paid taxes to the government. The royal administration was heavily organized. Scribes recorded land, harvests, taxes, and population. Alexandria, however, had a very different character. It was a major Mediterranean city filled with different languages and cultures. Greek elites held many important positions in government. Egyptians continued to practice their traditional religion. Jewish communities also became established in Egypt. The kingdom, therefore, contained several cultural worlds at once. Sometimes these communities interacted peacefully. At other times, tensions developed. The Ptolemaic rulers had to balance the interests of different populations. They presented themselves as Egyptian pharaohs while maintaining a Greek royal court. This dual identity became one of the defining features of Ptolemaic Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom remained powerful for generations, but over time, internal problems became more serious. Members of the royal family frequently competed for the throne. Civil wars weakened the government. Economic difficulties increased. Foreign powers became more involved in Egyptian affairs. One of those powers was Rome. Rome had grown from a city in Italy into a Mediterranean superpower. Its armies and political influence spread across the region. The Ptolemies increasingly depended on Roman support. Roman leaders began influencing Egyptian politics. The kingdom was still formally independent, but its freedom was becoming limited. By the 1st century BCE, the future of Ptolemaic Egypt was closely connected to Rome. The final and most famous Ptolemaic ruler would soon come to power. Her name was Cleopatra. She would become the last great ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and her reign would bring ancient Egypt into one of the most dramatic political struggles of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra VII became Queen of Egypt in 51 BCE. She was only about 18 years old. She inherited a kingdom that was wealthy but politically fragile for generations. Members of the Ptolemaic royal family had competed against one another for power. Cleopatra initially ruled alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. According to Ptolemaic tradition, the two were formally presented as joint rulers. But their relationship quickly became difficult. Cleopatra wanted to exercise real authority over the kingdom. Her brother's advisors wanted to strengthen his position instead. Political factions formed around the young rulers. Cleopatra also faced financial problems. Egypt owed large amounts of money to Rome, and Roman influence over Egyptian politics was growing. Despite these difficulties, Cleopatra proved to be an ambitious and capable ruler. She understood that Egypt could not simply ignore Rome. She needed to protect her throne, and she would soon find herself caught in a much larger Roman conflict. The struggle between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII eventually became open conflict. Cleopatra's political opponents gained control of Alexandria. She was forced to leave the capital from outside the city. Cleopatra began gathering supporters. She did not simply abandon her claim to the throne. Instead, she prepared to return. At the same time, a major political crisis was unfolding in Rome. Two of Rome's most powerful generals, Julius Caesar and Pompey, had become bitter enemies. Their rivalry eventually led to civil war. Caesar defeated Pompey's forces and pursued him toward Egypt. Pompey believed Egypt might provide him with protection, but when he arrived on the Egyptian coast, he was assassinated by supporters of Ptolemy XIII. Caesar soon arrived in Alexandria. The Roman general had entered a kingdom already divided by a struggle for power. Cleopatra now had an opportunity. If she could gain Caesar's support, she might be able to reclaim her throne, but reaching him would not be easy. Cleopatra needed to meet Caesar without being captured by her enemies. Ancient sources later described a famous story about how she entered Caesar's presence. She was reportedly brought secretly into the royal palace, concealed inside a rolled-up carpet or bedding. When the covering was opened, Cleopatra appeared before Caesar. Whether every detail of the story is accurate is uncertain, but the meeting itself certainly happened. Cleopatra understood that Caesar was now the most powerful man in Egypt. She needed his support. Caesar, meanwhile, wanted stability. Egypt was wealthy and strategically important. He also wanted to settle the dispute over the Egyptian throne. Cleopatra presented her case. She argued that she was the legitimate ruler of Egypt. Caesar decided to support her position, but Ptolemy XIII and his supporters refused to accept the decision. The political dispute soon became a military conflict. Alexandria was about to become a battlefield. Caesar's forces were relatively small compared with the armies that could potentially be raised in Egypt. He and his soldiers became trapped inside Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII's supporters controlled much of the city. Fighting broke out around the palace and harbour. The conflict became known as the Alexandrian War. During the fighting, a major fire broke out in Alexandria. Ancient sources connect the fire with the destruction of some stored scrolls. The exact extent of the damage remains uncertain. What is clear is that the conflict threatened the stability of the city. Caesar waited for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Cleopatra remained allied with him. Eventually, Caesar's forces received additional troops. The balance of power changed. Ptolemy XIII's army was defeated. During the fighting, Ptolemy XIII attempted to escape. He drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra had survived the struggle. She now returned to the throne, but she would not rule alone. After Ptolemy XIII's death, Cleopatra became the dominant ruler of Egypt. She was formally paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but Cleopatra held the real political authority. Her alliance with Caesar had saved her throne. Their relationship also became personal. Cleopatra became pregnant during her time with Caesar. She later gave birth to a son. The child was named Ptolemy Caesar. He became known by the nickname Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Cleopatra claimed that Caesar was the child's father. For Cleopatra, the child represented more than a family connection. He could potentially strengthen the legitimacy of her dynasty. Egypt now had a queen who was closely connected to the most powerful political figure in Rome. But Cleopatra understood that Caesar would eventually have to return to Rome. She needed to protect Egypt's independence, and she needed to make sure her dynasty survived without depending entirely on Caesar. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. She arrived with members of her royal household. Her presence attracted enormous attention. Rome was unlike Egypt. It was a rapidly expanding Mediterranean power filled with politicians, soldiers, merchants, and wealthy families. Cleopatra stayed near Caesar's residence. She was not simply a foreign queen visiting Rome. She was closely connected to Caesar himself. Her presence created both fascination and suspicion. Some Romans feared that Caesar was becoming too powerful. They worried about his relationship with a foreign monarch. Caesar himself had already accumulated enormous political authority. He had been named dictator. He had defeated his major rivals. And many Romans believed that the traditional political system was being threatened. Cleopatra eventually returned to Egypt. But the political crisis in Rome continued to grow. Caesar's enemies were becoming increasingly determined to stop him. On March 15, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar went to a meeting of the Roman Senate. A group of Roman senators had organized a conspiracy against him. They believed Caesar had become too powerful during the meeting. The conspirators attacked him. Caesar was killed. News of his assassination spread rapidly. For Cleopatra, the consequences were enormous. Her strongest Roman ally was gone. She was now responsible for protecting herself, her son, and Egypt. The Roman political world immediately became unstable. Caesar's assassins hoped that killing him would restore the old Roman Republic. Instead, another civil war followed. Two of Caesar's supporters became especially important. One was Mark Antony, one of Caesar's leading generals. The other was Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Both would eventually compete for control of Rome, and Cleopatra would become deeply involved in their struggle. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra returned to Egypt. Not long afterward, her brother Ptolemy XIV died. Cleopatra then made her young son Caesarion her co-ruler. The child was presented as Ptolemy XV Caesar. Cleopatra now ruled Egypt directly. She worked to strengthen the kingdom's economy. Egypt's agricultural wealth remained extremely important. The Nile continued to provide the kingdom with enormous quantities of grain. Cleopatra also understood that Rome's civil war could affect Egypt's survival. Different Roman leaders were competing for power. She would have to choose her alliances carefully. Egypt could not defeat Rome militarily, but Egypt's wealth made it valuable to Roman politicians. Cleopatra therefore used diplomacy, wealth, and political relationships to protect her kingdom. Her next major relationship would be with Mark Antony. That alliance would transform the political balance of the Eastern Mediterranean. After Caesar's death, Mark Antony became one of the most powerful men in Rome. He controlled large territories in the eastern Mediterranean. Antony needed money and resources to maintain his armies. Egypt had both in 41 BCE. Cleopatra met Antony at Tarsus. She arrived in great style, displaying the wealth of the Egyptian kingdom. Antony was impressed by the queen. Their relationship soon became both political and personal. Cleopatra provided Antony with resources. Antony, in return, supported Cleopatra's position and helped strengthen her control over parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Their alliance created a powerful partnership. But Rome was still divided. Octavian was becoming increasingly powerful in the west. Antony controlled much of the east. The rivalry between the two men was growing. And Cleopatra's alliance with Antony would eventually place her directly against Octavian. Cleopatra and Antony spent years building their alliance. They had children together. Cleopatra also gained control over additional territories in the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, Egypt appeared stronger. But Antony's relationship with Cleopatra became a major political issue in Rome. Octavian used it against him. He portrayed Antony as a Roman leader who had abandoned Rome for a foreign queen. He presented Cleopatra as a threat to Roman power. The Roman political struggle gradually became a conflict between Antony and Octavian. Both sides prepared their armies and fleets. Cleopatra committed Egyptian resources to Antony. The final confrontation was approaching. In 31 BCE, their forces met near the western coast of Greece. The battle would decide the future of Egypt. It would also determine who would control the Roman world. And after the Battle of Actium, the ancient Ptolemaic kingdom would never be the same again. The Battle of Actium changed the future of the Mediterranean world. On one side stood Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. On the other stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Their combined forces were large, but their position had become increasingly difficult. Octavian's fleet blocked their escape routes. After hours of fighting, Cleopatra's ships broke through the Roman blockade. Antony followed her. Much of their fleet was left behind. The battle was effectively lost. Cleopatra and Antony escaped to Egypt. But Octavian did not stop. He understood that defeating Antony was only the beginning. He needed to destroy Antony's remaining political and military power. Over the following months, Octavian prepared to invade Egypt. For Cleopatra, the situation was becoming desperate. Her kingdom had survived foreign invasions before, but this time the enemy was the rising power of Rome. In 30 BCE, Octavian's forces entered Egypt. Antony attempted to organize a final defense, but his position was extremely weak. Many of his soldiers had little reason to continue fighting. Some eventually joined Octavian. The Egyptian military could not stop the Roman advance. Alexandria was now threatened. Cleopatra began searching for a way to preserve her dynasty. She understood that military victory was unlikely. Her hope was that Octavian might allow her children to survive and perhaps preserve part of the royal family. Antony, however, believed that the situation was hopeless. The man who had once commanded enormous Roman armies now faced the destruction of everything he had built. The final struggle for Egypt had begun. As Octavian's forces approached Alexandria, Antony received devastating news. He was told that Cleopatra had died. The report was false, but Antony believed it, overwhelmed by despair. He attempted to take his own life. He was seriously wounded. Soon afterward, Antony learned that Cleopatra was still alive. He was carried to the place where she had taken refuge. According to ancient accounts, Antony was brought to Cleopatra's monument. He died there in 30 BCE. Cleopatra was now alone. Her greatest political ally was gone. Octavian was closing in on Alexandria. She knew that she could not defeat Rome militarily. But Cleopatra still hoped to negotiate with Octavian. She wanted to protect her children and preserve some part of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The fate of Egypt now depended on the decisions of one Roman ruler. Cleopatra eventually met with representatives of Octavian. She attempted to negotiate the future of Egypt. Octavian, however, had his own goals. He wanted the wealth of the kingdom. He also wanted to bring the Ptolemaic dynasty to an end. Cleopatra remained determined to protect her children. She had 3 children with Antony. In addition to Caesarion, they represented the future of her family. But Octavian had little interest in preserving an independent Egyptian monarchy. Egypt was too wealthy and too strategically important. The Nile provided enormous quantities of grain. Alexandria controlled an important Mediterranean harbour. And Egypt's location connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea and routes toward Arabia and Africa. For Rome, controlling Egypt meant controlling an extraordinary source of wealth. Cleopatra eventually realized that there was very little left she could do. The kingdom that had survived for almost 3 centuries was about to disappear. Cleopatra died in August of 30 BCE. The exact circumstances of her death remain uncertain. Ancient writers later claimed that she died from the bite of an asp, a poisonous snake associated with Egyptian royalty. But historians cannot confirm exactly how she died. What is certain is that Cleopatra chose death rather than being taken to Rome as a prisoner. She was about 39 years old. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty effectively came to an end. Her son, Caesarion, was also killed shortly afterward. Octavian had eliminated the final serious claim to an independent Ptolemaic throne. Egypt was now under Roman control for thousands of years. Egypt had been ruled by its own kings and pharaohs. Now the ancient kingdom had become part of a foreign empire, but Egyptian civilization itself did not disappear. Its temples remained, its people remained, its religious traditions continued. Egypt was entering a completely new era. Octavian soon became known as Augustus. He reorganized Egypt as a special Roman province, unlike many other Roman provinces. Egypt was placed under the authority of a governor chosen directly by the emperor. Roman senators were generally restricted from entering Egypt without permission. The reason was simple: Egypt was too valuable. Its grain could feed Rome's enormous population. Its ports connected the empire to international trade. Its fertile Nile valley produced enormous agricultural wealth. Roman soldiers were stationed throughout the country. New administrative centers developed. Taxes were collected through Roman institutions, but the Romans did not simply erase Egyptian traditions. They understood the importance of religion. Egyptian temples continued operating. Priests continued performing ancient ceremonies, and Roman emperors were sometimes represented in Egyptian temples wearing the traditional clothing of pharaohs. The rulers had changed once again, but many aspects of Egyptian culture remained remarkably resilient. Alexandria remained one of the greatest cities in the Roman world. Its harbour connected Egypt with the Mediterranean. Ships carried grain from Egypt toward Rome. Merchants brought goods from Africa, Arabia, India, and other distant regions. The city became even more multicultural. Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, and people from many other regions lived there. Greek remained extremely important in everyday life. Latin was used by Roman authorities. Egyptian religious traditions continued inside the temples. Alexandria was also an important center of learning. Its scholars continued studying mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. The city had changed rulers many times, but its international character remained. Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom. Instead, it had become one of the most important provinces of the Roman Empire, and its connection to Rome would last for centuries. During the 1st century CE, a new religion began spreading across the Roman world. It was Christianity. Christian communities eventually appeared in Egypt. Alexandria became one of the most important centers of early Christianity. The new religion gradually attracted people from different parts of Egyptian society, but its growth was not always peaceful. Roman authorities sometimes persecuted Christians. Egyptian Christians later remembered periods of persecution as times of great suffering. Despite these difficulties, Christianity continued spreading. By the following centuries, it had become deeply established in Egypt. Many Egyptians began abandoning the traditional religious system that had existed for thousands of years. Temples that had once been filled with priests and worshippers gradually lost their importance. The old gods were increasingly replaced by Christian beliefs. Egypt was undergoing another enormous cultural transformation. In the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire itself changed dramatically. Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and later supported the new religion. Christianity became increasingly powerful throughout the empire. Egypt became an important center of Christian scholarship and monasticism. Monks traveled into the deserts to live lives devoted to prayer and religious discipline. These communities would influence Christian traditions far beyond Egypt. Alexandria remained an important intellectual and religious center, but political divisions within Christianity also created conflicts. Different Christian communities disagreed over theology and church authority. Egypt developed its own distinctive Christian tradition, which would later become associated with the Coptic Church. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire had become divided. Egypt was now part of the eastern half of the empire. This Eastern Empire would eventually become known as the Byzantine Empire. The world of the ancient pharaohs was now almost completely gone. By the 7th century, Egypt was facing another major change. The Byzantine Empire controlled the country, but the empire had been weakened by long wars with the Persian Empire. Then a new power emerged from Arabia. The Arab armies had rapidly expanded across the Middle East. In the early 640s, Arab forces entered Egypt under the command of Omar ibn el-As. The Byzantine defences struggled to stop them. After a series of battles and sieges, Arab forces captured Alexandria. By around 640 to CE, Byzantine rule in Egypt had effectively ended. Egypt had once again changed rulers. But this conquest would have consequences far beyond politics. Arabic gradually became more important. Islam spread throughout the country over many generations. Egypt's language, religion, and culture would transform. The civilization of the pharaohs had survived Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines. Now Egypt was entering the medieval Islamic world. And the story of Egypt was about to continue in an entirely new chapter. After the Arab conquest, Egypt became part of the expanding Islamic world. The new rulers established their administration along the Nile. Omar ibn el-As became the first Arab governor of Egypt. Near the northern edge of the Nile Valley, he established a new settlement called Fustat, unlike Alexandria. Fustat was designed as a center of Arab military and political power. A mosque was built there, traditionally associated with Omar ibn el-As. The city grew rapidly, soldiers settled there with their families, merchants arrived. Markets developed, and Egyptian farmers continued cultivating the fertile land along the Nile. For ordinary Egyptians, the change in government did not immediately transform every part of daily life. The agricultural cycle continued, taxes continued to be collected, and Christian communities remained an important part of Egyptian society. Arabic, however, gradually became more important in government and administration. Egypt was beginning to develop a new identity. It was still the land of the Nile, but it was now connected to a vast Islamic civilization stretching across 3 continents. For centuries after the conquest, Egypt contained both Christian and Muslim communities. Most Egyptians were still Christian during the early centuries of Muslim rule, The Coptic Church remained an important institution. Monasteries continued operating in the deserts. Churches remained active in towns and villages at the same time. Muslim communities grew. Arab soldiers and settlers established families in Egypt. Trade brought people from other parts of the Islamic world over generations. Conversion to Islam gradually increased. The process was not immediate. Egypt did not suddenly become entirely Muslim after the conquest. Instead, religious change happened slowly over many generations. Arabic also gradually replaced Egyptian languages in many areas. The Egyptian language survived for centuries in written Coptic and in Christian religious traditions. Eventually, Arabic became the dominant language of everyday life. Egypt was becoming culturally connected to the wider Islamic world, while still preserving elements of its older identity. For several decades, Egypt was governed under the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyads ruled an enormous empire stretching from Spain and North Africa across the Middle East and into Central Asia. Egypt was one of its most important provinces. Its agricultural wealth made it extremely valuable. Grain from the Nile Valley helped supply other parts of the empire. The government depended heavily on taxation. Officials recorded agricultural production and collected revenue from the countryside. Fustat continued to grow. Its location made it an important center for trade between the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Red Sea. But political changes were taking place across the Islamic world. In the 8th century, opposition to the Umayyads grew. A new dynasty eventually defeated them. The Abbasids took control of the Caliphate in 750 CE. Egypt remained an important province, but it would soon begin moving toward greater political independence. The Abbasid Caliphate established its capital at Baghdad. From there, the Abbasid rulers governed a vast Islamic empire. Egypt remained under Abbasid authority, but the distance from Baghdad made direct control difficult. Local governors became increasingly powerful. One of the most important was Ahmad ibn Tulun in the 9th century. Ibn Tulun established control over Egypt and Syria. He founded a new capital near Fustat called Al-Qatari. The city contained palaces, markets, and a famous mosque. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun still survives in Cairo and is one of the great monuments of Islamic architecture. Ibn Tulun's rule demonstrated that Egypt could once again become the center of a powerful regional state. But his dynasty did not last forever. After his successors lost power, Egypt returned to Abbasid influence. The political situation would continue changing, and another dynasty from North Africa would soon transform Egypt again. In the 10th century, a new power emerged in North Africa. The Fatimid Caliphate expanded eastward. In 969 CE, Fatimid forces conquered Egypt. The Fatimids founded a new city beside Fustat. Its name was Cairo. The city would eventually become one of the most important capitals in the Islamic world. The Fatimids also established the great institution of Al-Azhar, originally founded as a center of Ismaili Shia learning. It later became one of the world's most famous centers of Islamic scholarship. The Fatimid rulers transformed Egypt into the center of their caliphate. Cairo grew rapidly. Palaces, mosques, markets, and administrative buildings filled the new capital. Egypt's position was once again strategically important. The country connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. It also controlled valuable agricultural land. The Fatimid period marked another major transformation in Egyptian history. Cairo became increasingly important under the Fatimids. Its location near the Nile gave it access to Egypt's agricultural wealth. Its position between the Mediterranean and Red Sea made it a major trading center. Merchants arrived from across the Islamic world. Goods traveled through the city from Africa, Arabia, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Cairo's population grew. Its streets became crowded with craftsmen. merchants, scholars, soldiers, and government officials. The city was also surrounded by important religious institutions. Mosques and schools were constructed throughout the capital. Meanwhile, Fustat remained an important commercial centre nearby. Together, the two cities formed one of the most important urban regions in the medieval Middle East. Egypt had once again become a major centre of political and economic power. But the Fatimid state eventually faced serious problems. Political instability and military conflicts weakened the caliphate. And a powerful Kurdish military commander would soon arrive in Egypt, that Commander Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Better known in the West as Saladin, Saladin came to Egypt in the 12th century. At the time, the Fatimid government was weakening. Saladin eventually became the ruler of Egypt. He ended the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171. Egypt was brought back into the Sunni Islamic political world. Saladin also built a new dynasty known as the Ayyubids. His power extended beyond Egypt. He controlled territories in Syria and other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. But Saladin is best remembered for his conflict with the Crusader states. The Crusades had brought European armies into the eastern Mediterranean. Saladin fought to regain territories controlled by the Crusaders. In 1187, his army defeated the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin. The victory opened the way for the recovery of Jerusalem. Saladin became one of the most famous Muslim rulers of the medieval period. After the Ayyubid period, another military elite rose to power in Egypt. They were known as the Mamluks. Many Mamluks had originally been enslaved soldiers recruited from regions north of the Black Sea and Central Asia. They were trained as highly skilled cavalrymen. Over time, they became enormously powerful within Egypt's military and political system. In 1250, the Mamluks took control of Egypt. They established a powerful sultanate centered in Cairo. Their rule lasted for centuries. The Mamluks faced one of the greatest military threats of the medieval world. The Mongols had conquered enormous territories across Asia and the Middle East. In 1260, Mamluk forces confronted the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The Mamluks won. The victory helped stop the Mongol advance into Egypt. Cairo remained independent. The Mamluk Sultanate became one of the strongest states in the eastern Mediterranean. Under the Mamluks, Cairo became one of the great cities of the medieval world. Its skyline filled with mosques, schools, markets, palaces, and monumental tombs. Mamluk rulers competed to build impressive religious and public architecture. Trade also flourished. Egypt's location connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. Merchants could transport goods between Europe, Africa, Arabia, and Asia. Cairo became an important center for international commerce. The Mamluks also controlled important pilgrimage routes toward Mecca and Medina. But their power depended heavily on military organization. Sultans frequently fought among themselves. Political instability sometimes weakened the government. Meanwhile, new trade routes were developing around the world. European merchants were increasingly searching for direct maritime routes to Asia. These changes would eventually reduce Egypt's importance in some international trade networks. And another empire was rising in the east. By the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become one of the most powerful states in the world. Its ruler, Sultan Selim I, expanded Ottoman control into the Middle East in 1516. Ottoman forces defeated the Mamluks in Syria. The following year, they invaded Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate collapsed. Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire. Cairo remained an important city. The Ottomans preserved many existing institutions and allowed local elites to continue playing important roles. The Arabic language remained dominant. Islam remained the major religion. Egyptian traditions continued, but political authority now came from Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Egypt had once again become part of a much larger imperial system. The country had passed through pharaonic kingdoms, Persian rule, Greek dynasties, Roman emperors, Byzantine rulers, Arab caliphates, Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks. Now the Ottomans controlled the Nile Valley. But Egypt's history was far from over. In the centuries ahead, European powers would increasingly challenge Ottoman influence. And eventually, Egypt would enter the modern world when the Ottoman Empire conquered Egypt in 1517. Cairo remained one of the most important cities in the region. The Mamluk system was not completely destroyed. Many local officials and powerful families continued to influence Egyptian affairs. The Ottoman government appointed governors to represent the Sultan. But controlling Egypt from Istanbul was not always easy. The Nile Valley was far from the Ottoman capital. Local leaders could accumulate considerable power. Egypt's agricultural wealth remained extremely important. Its grain-supported cities throughout the empire. Cairo also remained a major center of Islamic scholarship and trade for centuries. Ottoman Egypt experienced periods of stability and periods of political competition. The Ottoman Empire itself gradually faced growing challenges. European powers were becoming stronger. New trade routes were changing the movement of goods around the world, and Egypt's strategic position between Europe, Africa, and Asia was becoming more important than ever. In 1798, a French army led by Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. Napoleon wanted to weaken Britain's access to India and establish French influence in the eastern Mediterranean. French troops defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids. The battle took place near the Great Pyramids of Giza. Although the pyramids had already stood for thousands of years, they became a dramatic backdrop to this new European invasion. Napoleon's forces captured Cairo, but French control was far from secure. The Ottoman Empire declared war against France. British naval forces also attacked the French fleet. The French army eventually became isolated in Egypt. Napoleon himself returned to France in 1799. French forces remained for a short time longer, but in 1801, they were forced to leave. The invasion had failed to establish a lasting French empire in Egypt. Yet it had exposed the growing military and technological power of Europe. Egypt was entering a new period of transformation. After the French withdrawal, Egypt entered a period of political uncertainty. Different groups competed for influence. Ottoman officials, Mamluk leaders, and local forces struggled for control. Out of this instability emerged an Albanian-born Ottoman commander named Muhammad Ali. By 1805, he had become the ruler of Egypt. Muhammad Ali wanted to build a powerful modern state. He reorganized the army. He introduced new military training methods. Factories were established to produce weapons and other supplies. Agriculture was reorganized to increase state revenue. New irrigation projects expanded cultivated land. Muhammad Ali also encouraged the cultivation of crops that could be exported to Europe. Cotton became especially important. The Egyptian government became more centralized. Muhammad Ali's dynasty would remain influential in Egypt for generations. His reforms did not simply copy European systems. They combined Ottoman traditions with new military and economic ideas. Egypt was becoming increasingly independent in practice, even though it remained formally connected to the Ottoman Empire. Egypt's location had always made it important for trade. But in the 19th century, a massive engineering project would transform that importance. The Suez Canal was constructed across the Isthmus of Suez. Its purpose was to connect the Mediterranean Sea directly with the Red Sea. Before the canal, ships traveling between Europe and Asia often had to sail around the southern tip of Africa. The canal created a much shorter route. Construction took years and required enormous amounts of labor. In 1869, the Suez Canal officially opened. Ships could now travel directly between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Egypt suddenly became one of the most strategically important places in the world. European powers recognized the canal's enormous value. Britain became particularly interested because the route was extremely important for reaching India. Egypt's connection to global trade had been transformed. But the canal also brought foreign financial and political influence. The Egyptian government had borrowed heavily to finance development projects. Over time, Egypt accumulated enormous debts. European governments and financial institutions became increasingly involved in Egyptian affairs. Britain eventually purchased a major share of the Suez Canal Company. European influence over Egypt continued to grow. Egyptian nationalists became increasingly frustrated. They believed foreign powers were interfering too deeply in their country. In 1882, a revolt led by Egyptian military officers and nationalists challenged the government. Britain responded by sending troops. British forces defeated the Egyptian resistance. Egypt was not formally turned into a British colony at that moment, but Britain gained enormous control over the country's government and economy. The British presence would last for decades. Egyptian nationalism, however, continued to grow. More Egyptians began demanding political independence. The struggle would become one of the defining stories of modern Egyptian history. The First World War created new tensions in Egypt. Britain declared Egypt a protectorate in 1914. Egyptian nationalists wanted independence. One of the most important figures was Saad Zaghloul. He and his supporters demanded that Egyptians be allowed to negotiate directly over their country's future. When Zaghloul and other nationalist leaders were arrested and exiled in 1919, mass protests erupted. Workers went on strike, students demonstrated. Farmers joined the resistance. People across different parts of Egyptian society participated. The British authorities struggled to restore order. The movement became known as the Egyptian Revolution of 1919. It did not immediately end British influence, but it demonstrated the strength of Egyptian nationalism. In 1922, Britain formally recognized Egypt as an independent kingdom. However, British troops remained in important locations. The king and Egyptian government also had to operate within limits imposed by British power. Egypt had gained greater independence, but the struggle for complete sovereignty was not finished. The Kingdom of Egypt was established in 1922. King Fuad I became the country's monarch. Egypt developed a parliamentary political system. Political parties competed for power. Elections were held. Newspapers and political organizations became increasingly important. Cairo expanded into a modern capital. Egyptian universities educated a growing generation of professionals and intellectuals. But political life remained unstable. The monarchy competed with political parties. British influence continued. Economic inequality remained widespread. Most Egyptians still depended on agriculture. The countryside could be extremely poor compared with the wealthy urban elite. Egypt was also changing culturally. Radio, cinema, newspapers, and modern education spread throughout society. Cairo became an important cultural center for the Arab world. Egyptian music and films reached audiences across the Middle East. The country was becoming modern in many ways. But beneath this modernization were deep political and economic tensions. Those tensions would eventually help bring down the monarchy. By the early 1950s, opposition to the monarchy and British influence had grown. Egypt had also suffered humiliation during the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. A group of military officers known as the Free Officers organized against the existing political system on July 23, 1952. They launched a coup. King Farouk was forced to abdicate. The monarchy was eventually abolished. Egypt became a republic. One of the leading figures of the revolution was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser would soon become the dominant political figure in Egypt. He promoted Arab nationalism. He opposed European colonial influence. He also wanted Egypt to become more economically independent. The revolution transformed Egyptian politics. The era of the monarchy had ended. A new republican Egypt was beginning. And Nasser would soon make Egypt one of the most influential countries in the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser became president of Egypt in 1956. One of his most important decisions came that same year. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The canal had been controlled by a largely European company. Nasser argued that Egypt should control the canal and use its revenues for national development. Britain and France opposed the decision. Israel also launched an invasion of Egypt. The crisis quickly became an international confrontation. But Britain and France faced strong opposition from the United States and the Soviet Union. Under international pressure, the invading forces withdrew. Nasser emerged from the crisis with enormous popularity across the Arab world. The Suez Crisis demonstrated that the old European powers could no longer easily impose their will on Egypt. Nasser became a symbol of Arab nationalism and resistance to foreign intervention. Egypt's influence in the region had grown dramatically. Nasser also wanted to transform Egypt's economy. One of his most ambitious projects was the Aswan High Dam. The dam was built across the Nile in southern Egypt. Its purpose was to control flooding, provide water for agriculture, and generate electricity. The project was enormous. Construction involved thousands of workers and lasted for years. The dam created Lake Nasser, one of the world's largest artificial lakes. But the project also had consequences. The annual Nile floods had once carried nutrient-rich sediment onto farmland. The dam changed this natural cycle. Several ancient monuments were also threatened by the rising waters. An international effort helped move famous temples, including Abu Simbel, to higher ground. The Aswan High Dam became a symbol of modern Egyptian development. It demonstrated the enormous changes taking place in the country. But Nasser's presidency would also be shaped by war and political conflict. In 1967, Egypt entered another major war with Israel. The conflict lasted only 6 days. Egypt and its allies suffered a devastating defeat. Egypt lost control of the Sinai Peninsula. The defeat was a major shock to Nasser and to the wider Arab world. Nasser initially announced his resignation, but massive demonstrations called for him to remain in power. He continued as president. Egypt's economy and military were placed under enormous pressure. The country entered a period known as the War of Attrition against Israel. Fighting continued along the Suez Canal. Nasser remained a hugely influential figure, but his health was deteriorating. On September 28, 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser died. Millions of Egyptians participated in his funeral. His death marked the end of one of the most influential political eras in modern Egyptian history. His successor would take Egypt in a different direction. After Nasser's death, Anwar Sadat became president at first. Many observers underestimated him. But Sadat gradually began changing Egypt's political and economic direction. He wanted to recover the territory lost during the 1967 war. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and entered the Sinai Peninsula. The fighting became another major Arab-Israeli war. Although Egypt did not completely recover the Sinai during the war, the conflict changed the political situation. Sadat eventually pursued negotiations with Israel. This was a dramatic change from Nasser's era. Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David Accords in 1978. In 1979, they signed a peace treaty Egypt became the first Arab country to formally recognize Israel. The decision was controversial throughout the Arab world, but it eventually led to the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. In 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by Islamist militants during a military parade. His vice president, Hosni Mubarak, became president. Mubarak would remain in power for nearly 30 years. During his presidency, Egypt maintained its peace treaty with Israel. The country remained an important ally of the United States. Cairo continued to play a major role in Arab diplomacy. But Egypt faced serious internal problems. The population grew rapidly. Unemployment and poverty remained major concerns. The gap between wealthy and poor Egyptians was significant. Political opposition was tightly restricted. The Muslim Brotherhood became one of the most important opposition movements, although it was often banned from formal political participation. At the same time, militant Islamist groups carried out attacks inside Egypt. The government responded with extensive security measures. For years, the political system remained stable on the surface. But beneath it, frustration was building. By the beginning of the 21st century, Egypt was one of the most populous countries in the Arab world. Cairo had grown into a massive metropolitan area. Millions of people lived in and around the capital. Egypt remained dependent on the Nile. Agriculture continued to employ millions. Tourism became an important source of income. The Suez Canal remained one of the world's most important shipping routes. Egypt also had a large and influential military, but economic problems continued. Young Egyptians faced high unemployment. Many people were frustrated with corruption and political restrictions. The internet and social media were beginning to change how Egyptians communicated. A younger generation increasingly questioned the political system. Hosni Mubarak had ruled Egypt for decades, but by the end of the 2000s, the country was entering a period of extraordinary political tension. Then, in 2011, events across the Arab world would reach Egypt, and the consequences would change the country forever. The events of 2011 changed Egypt more dramatically than almost anything. That had happened since the military revolution of 1952. On January 25th, Egyptians began gathering in cities across the country. The demonstrations were inspired partly by the uprising that had already begun in Tunisia, but Egypt had its own reasons for unrest. Many young Egyptians faced unemployment and limited political opportunities. Corruption was widely criticized. The emergency laws that had existed for decades restricted political activity, and after almost 30 years under Hosni Mubarak, many Egyptians believed the political system had become incapable of changing. The largest demonstrations developed in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Students, workers, activists, Islamists, liberals, Christians, and ordinary families all appeared among the crowds. They did not necessarily agree about what Egypt should become, but they increasingly agreed that the old political order could not continue unchanged. The demonstrations continued for 18 days. The government attempted to contain the unrest, but the crowds kept returning. Television broadcasts showed the demonstrations to millions of Egyptians. The internet and social media helped protesters communicate. Although the government attempted to restrict access, security forces confronted demonstrators. There were deaths, injuries, arrests, and clashes. Meanwhile, the Egyptian military became increasingly important. The army had been one of the central institutions of the Egyptian state since the revolution of 1952 on February 11th, 2011. Hosni Mubarak resigned. After nearly 30 years as president, he was no longer in power. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, commonly known as the SCF, assumed responsibility for governing the country for many Egyptians. This was an extraordinary moment. A president who had seemed almost permanent had fallen, but removing Mubarak was only the beginning. Egypt now had to answer a much harder question: what would replace the political system that had ruled the country for decades? The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces was led by Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi. The military promised to guide Egypt toward elections and a new political order. Parliamentary elections were eventually held. For the first time in decades, political groups that had faced severe restrictions were able to organize openly. Among them was the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had existed since 1920, when Hassan al-Banna founded it in it. Over the decades, it developed into one of the most influential Islamist movements in Egypt. It created networks of schools, charities, medical services, religious institutions, and political organizations. It had also experienced periods of severe repression under successive governments. After the 2011 revolution, the Brotherhood created the Freedom and Justice Party. It quickly became one of the strongest political forces in post-Mubarak Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood's political success alarmed some Egyptians while inspiring others. Its supporters argued that the organization had deep roots in Egyptian society and had long provided social services too. Communities neglected by the state, its opponents feared that the Brotherhood wanted to transform Egypt into a religious state. The debate was not simply between Islamists and secular Egyptians. Egyptian society contained many different political currents. There were liberals, leftists, nationalists, Islamists, conservatives, Christians, secular activists, and people who simply wanted stability. The parliamentary elections of 2011 and 2012 demonstrated the strength of Islamist parties. The Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party became the largest political force in parliament. The more conservative Salafi al-Nur party also performed strongly. The political landscape had changed almost overnight. But parliamentary success was only the beginning. Egypt would soon hold its first competitive presidential election since the revolution. And the result would bring Mohammed Morsi to power. In June 2012, Mohammed Morsi was declared the winner of Egypt's presidential election. He became the first president from the Muslim Brotherhood and the first civilian president to take office after the 1952 revolution. For his supporters, his victory represented a historic achievement. For his opponents, it raised concerns about the future direction of Egypt. Morsi inherited enormous problems. The economy was struggling, tourism had declined, foreign investment had weakened. The government faced shortages and rising prices. Political institutions were still being rebuilt, and the relationship between the presidency, parliament, courts, military, and revolutionary movements remained uncertain. Morsi attempted to consolidate his authority, but the country remained deeply divided. The Muslim Brotherhood had won elections, but winning elections did not mean that it had won the trust of everyone who had participated in the revolution. Egypt's political transition was becoming increasingly unstable. In November 2012, Morsi issued a constitutional declaration that temporarily expanded his powers and limited the ability of courts to challenge his decisions. The announcement produced another wave of demonstrations. Opponents accused Morsi of attempting to concentrate power in the presidency. Supporters argued that the measures were necessary to protect the political transition from institutions associated with the old regime. The drafting of a new constitution became another major source of conflict. Islamists, liberals, Christians, and secular activists disagreed over the role of religion, individual rights, the judiciary, and the structure of the state. The Muslim Brotherhood itself was not Egypt's only Islamist organization. Salafi movements had become increasingly influential. Al-Nur represented a more conservative political current. Other Islamist groups rejected participation in conventional politics altogether. Egypt therefore entered a complicated political struggle involving religion, democracy, nationalism, and the role of the military. The revolution had removed Mubarak, but it had not created agreement about what Egypt should become. By the summer of 2013, opposition to Morsi had become enormous. A grassroots movement known as Tamarod collected signatures demanding his resignation. On June 30th, millions of Egyptians participated in demonstrations against Morsi. Supporters of the president also organized their own protests. The country appeared increasingly divided between competing visions of its future. The military intervened on July 3. Defense Minister Abdel Fattah el-Sisi announced that Morsi had been removed from office. The constitution was suspended temporarily. The head of Egypt's Supreme Constitutional Court, Adli Mansour, became acting president. Morsi and senior Muslim Brotherhood figures were arrested. The Brotherhood rejected the military's intervention and called for Morsi's return. What followed was a period of severe confrontation. Large pro-Morsi demonstrations were eventually broken up by security forces. Hundreds of people died during the violence. The Muslim Brotherhood was later banned in Egypt. Its leadership was imprisoned, went underground, or left the country. Adli Mansour served as acting president during the transition. His presidency lasted less than a year. But it was important because Egypt was once again being governed through a political system dominated by the military establishment. A new constitution was approved in January 2014. It strengthened protections for some rights while also preserving a powerful role for the armed forces. Meanwhile, Egypt's security situation deteriorated. Militant organizations carried out attacks against police and soldiers. The most serious violence developed in the Sinai Peninsula. An organization known as Ansar Beit al-Maqdis eventually pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and became known as Wilayat Sinai. Other extremist organizations also operated within Egypt or attempted to carry out attacks. The government responded with major security operations at the same time. Egypt's political opposition faced extensive restrictions. The country was moving away from the revolutionary atmosphere of 2011. Stability and security had once again become the government's central priorities. In 2014, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was elected president. He had previously served as defense minister and commander of the Egyptian armed forces. Sisi presented himself as the leader who could restore stability after years of political turmoil. His government emphasized security, economic development, and large national projects. Supporters viewed this as a necessary response to the instability following the revolution. Critics argued that Egypt was returning to an authoritarian political system. Both perspectives became central to understanding modern Egypt. Under Sisi, political opposition was heavily restricted. Independent activists, journalists, and organizations faced increasing pressure. The government continued its campaign against the Muslim Brotherhood and militant groups. At the same time, enormous infrastructure projects transformed parts of the country. Egypt's political system had entered another new phase. The revolutionary hopes of 2011 had been replaced by a government determined to prevent another period of mass instability. The Sinai Peninsula became one of the greatest security challenges of the Sisi era. Militant organizations attacked Egyptian military and police positions. Some militants pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. The conflict became especially severe in northern Sinai. Egyptian forces launched extensive military operations. Roads were controlled by checkpoints. Military bases expanded. Some communities were relocated from areas considered strategically important. The conflict was not limited to soldiers. Civilians were also killed in terrorist attacks. One of the most devastating attacks occurred in 2017 at a mosque in northern Sinai, where more than 300 people were killed. The Egyptian state responded with an intensified military campaign. Over time, the insurgency became less capable of carrying out large-scale attacks. But Sinai remained strategically important. It connects Africa with Asia, borders Israel and Gaza, and contains the approaches to the Suez Canal. For Egypt, controlling Sinai has always been a matter of national security. Sisi's government also pursued a major economic transformation. Egypt faced enormous financial pressures. The country needed foreign currency, investment, employment, and infrastructure. The government introduced economic reforms, including currency devaluation and reductions in some subsidies. These policies were supported by international financial institutions and were intended to stabilize the economy. But they also produced painful consequences. Prices increased, inflation placed pressure on ordinary households. Many Egyptians struggled with the rising cost of food, transportation, and housing. At the same time, the government invested heavily in infrastructure. New roads crossed the desert, power stations expanded electricity generation. New housing projects were built, industrial zones were developed. Egyptian governments had repeatedly attempted to reshape the country through enormous national projects. The Aswan High Dam had been one example, the Suez Canal had been another. Now, the modern Egyptian state was attempting the same on an even larger urban and economic scale. The new administrative capital became one of the most visible symbols of modern Egypt. Government, ministries, and institutions began moving toward the new city. Skyscrapers rose from the desert. New roads connected the development to Cairo and other parts of the country. The goal was partly to reduce pressure on Cairo. The old capital had become enormously crowded. Traffic, pollution, housing shortages, and population growth had transformed the metropolitan area. A country whose civilization once depended on villages along the Nile now contains more than 100 million people living within a largely desert landscape. Education has always been important to modern Egyptian society. Egypt developed one of the largest education systems in the Arab world. Cairo's Al-Azhar University remained one of the most influential centers of Islamic scholarship anywhere in the world. Egyptian universities educated millions of students in medicine, engineering, science, law, literature, economics, and the arts, but rapid population growth created enormous pressure on schools and universities. Classrooms became crowded. Egypt has faced a severe teacher deficit of nearly 500,000 educators in recent years. The government invested in new schools, universities, and technical education. Egypt also expanded digital education and technology programs, yet education remained connected to one of the country's oldest problems. How could a rapidly growing population create enough opportunities for its young people? The question was especially important because Egypt has a very young population. Millions of Egyptians enter working age every year. Their education, employment, and expectations will influence the country's future. The Nile once supported Egypt through agriculture. In modern Egypt, human knowledge has become just as important a resource. Egypt's influence has never been limited to politics. Its cultural influence across the Arab world has been enormous. During the 20th century, Cairo became one of the major centers of Arabic cinema. Egyptian films were distributed throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Musicians such as Kulthum became cultural icons. Her voice was heard across the Arab world through radio broadcasts and concerts. Later, Egyptian television dramas became equally influential. Egyptian Arabic became widely understood because of the country's enormous film and television industry. Modern Egyptian culture also continued older traditions, calligraphy remained important. Traditional crafts survived alongside modern design. Islamic architecture continued to shape Cairo. Coptic Christian traditions remained an important part of Egyptian society. And ancient Egyptian imagery became one of the country's most recognizable cultural symbols. The modern Egyptian identity, therefore, contained layers from thousands of years of history. And beneath all of these modern changes remained the Nile. For thousands of years, Egyptian civilization had depended on the river. Today, that dependence is even more important. Most Egyptians live in the Nile Valley and Delta, while the majority of the country is desert. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam became one of Egypt's most serious strategic concerns. Ethiopia began constructing the dam on the Blue Nile in 2011. Ethiopia argued that the project was essential for generating electricity and economic development. Egypt worried about how the filling and operation of the reservoir could affect the amount and timing of water reaching downstream countries. Sudan became an important participant in the dispute. Negotiations continued for years. The issue demonstrated something remarkable about Egyptian history. The technology may have changed. The governments may have changed. The languages and religions of the population may have changed. But the Nile remained at the center of Egypt's survival. Egypt also remained one of the most important political powers in the Arab world. Its geographic position gave it enormous strategic importance. The Suez Canal connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. The Sinai Peninsula connected Africa with Asia. The country bordered Libya, Sudan, Israel, and the Gaza Strip. Egypt maintained its peace treaty with Israel. It remained an important military power. Egypt was particularly important during crises involving Gaza. The country also maintained relationships with the United States, Europe, African states, and Arab governments. Egypt's foreign policy was therefore shaped by geography as much as ideology. For thousands of years, Egypt's location had made it a crossroads. In the modern era, the geography remained one of its greatest sources of influence. Modern Egypt is also home to one of the world's oldest Christian communities. The Coptic Orthodox Church traces its history to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The church became an important part of Egyptian identity long before the Arab conquest of the 7th century. Today, Coptic Christians remain a significant part of Egyptian society. The exact proportion is disputed because Egypt does not publish a universally accepted religious census. But Coptic Christians form a substantial community with churches, monasteries, schools, charities, and cultural institutions throughout the country. Under Pope Tawadros Duakop Church has remained an important institution. At the same time, Egypt's Muslim majority contains many different traditions and interpretations. Sunni Islam dominates religious life. Al-Azhar remains a major center of Islamic scholarship. Sufi traditions, conservative movements, reformers, and other currents have all existed within Egyptian society. Modern Egypt, therefore, cannot be understood through a single religious identity. Its history has always involved interaction between different communities. Egypt's ancient past also became increasingly important to the modern economy and national identity. The pyramids at Giza became symbols recognized around the entire world. Luxor's temples attracted millions of visitors. The Valley of the Kings preserved the tombs of ancient rulers. Abu Simbel survived the construction of the Aswan High Dam because an international campaign moved the temples to higher ground. Museums became another bridge between ancient and modern Egypt. The Grand Egyptian Museum, developed near the pyramids, became one of the country's most important cultural projects. Modern Egypt increasingly presented its ancient heritage not simply as something belonging to the distant past, but as part of a continuous national story. The pharaohs had disappeared, the languages had changed, the religions had changed, Foreign empires had ruled the land, yet the name Egypt itself had survived. And Egyptians continued to live along the same river that had supported civilization thousands of years earlier. When viewed from a distance, Egyptian history can appear almost impossible to comprehend. The first unified Egyptian state emerged more than 5,000 years ago. Pharaohs built temples and pyramids. Farmers cultivated the Nile Valley. Then came Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Christianity transformed Egyptian religious life. The Arab conquest introduced Islam and Arabic. Successive Muslim dynasties built Cairo into one of the great cities of the medieval world. The Ottomans later incorporated Egypt into their empire. European powers transformed its economy and politics. A monarchy ruled the country. Then came the revolution of 1952. Naguib became the first president of the Republic. Nasser transformed Egypt into a major Arab nationalist power. Sadat changed its foreign policy. Mubarak presided over 3 decades of stability and authoritarian rule. The revolution of 2011 ended his presidency. Morsi's brief government brought the Muslim Brotherhood into national power. Adli Mansur led the transition, and Sisi established a new period dominated by security, infrastructure, and centralized government. Yet there is something deeper connecting all these periods. Egyptian civilization was never simply a collection of monuments. It was a society: farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, merchants, priests, scholars, teachers, artists, engineers, mothers, fathers, children, and rulers all contributed to its survival. The ancient Egyptians wrote poetry. They created paintings and sculpture. They developed mathematics and medicine. Later, Egyptians built mosques and churches. They produced philosophers and scholars. They created some of the most influential Arabic films and music of the modern era. They built universities, factories, bridges, canals, dams, cities, and museums. The forms changed, the political systems changed, the religions changed. But Egyptian society continued adapting. That ability to absorb change may be one of the greatest continuities in the country's history. Today, Egypt remains a country of extraordinary contrasts. Ancient temples stand near modern highways. Cairo's crowded streets exist beside newly planned cities. Mosques and churches stand throughout the same urban landscape. Traditional markets operate alongside shopping centers and digital businesses. Farmers still cultivate land along the Nile while engineers work on modern infrastructure. Egyptians use smartphones and social media while preserving traditions that are centuries old. The country faces serious challenges. Population growth places pressure on water and resources. Economic difficulties affect millions of families. Political freedoms remain a subject of intense debate. Climate change threatens parts of the Nile Delta. Regional conflicts continue to affect Egypt's security and economy. But Egypt has faced difficult periods before. Its history is filled with invasions, famines, political collapse, foreign domination, revolution, and war. And, repeatedly, Egyptian society rebuilt itself. Egypt's story does not end with a president, a revolution, or a date on a calendar. It began long before the modern state existed. When communities along the Nile learned to turn a narrow strip of fertile land into one of the world's first great civilizations. From those beginnings came kingdoms, temples, cities, languages, religions, and ideas that would survive long after the people who created them were gone. The pharaohs disappeared, their kingdoms became ruins. Greek rulers came, and then Rome. Christianity transformed the country. Followed centuries later by the arrival of Islam and the Arabic language, new dynasties built new capitals. Foreign armies arrived and eventually left. Yet through every transformation, Egypt remained more than the empire that happened to control it. Its history was carried by ordinary people as much as by rulers. Farmers returned to the fields after the Nile rose and fell. Craftsmen shaped stone, wood, metal, and glass. Scholars filled libraries with knowledge. Poets wrote about love and loss. Musicians gave voices to generations. Teachers passed knowledge to children. Families built their lives around traditions that changed slowly, even when governments changed overnight. Modern Egypt inherited all of those layers. Its mosques stand beside churches. Ancient monuments rise above modern cities. Traditional markets exist alongside universities, factories, highways, and skyscrapers. Egyptian films, music, literature, art, and scholarship continue to reach far beyond the country's borders. The civilization did not survive because it remained unchanged. It survived because it learned how to change. There were centuries of prosperity and centuries of hardship. There were invasions, occupations, wars, revolutions, political struggles, and economic crises. There were moments when Egypt seemed divided beyond repair. Yet, again and again, life continued along the Nile. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Egypt entered another transformation. Monarchies gave way to republics. Naguib, Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, Morsi, Adli Mansur, and Sisi each represented a different chapter in the country's modern political story. Their governments rose and fell amid wars, revolutions, economic reforms, religious movements, and struggles over what Egypt should become. But presidents are only brief figures in a history this old. A presidency may last years or decades. A dynasty may last generations. Egypt itself has endured for millennia. That is why the deepest story is not about who sat in the palace or who commanded the army. It is about the society that remained after each ruler was gone. And at the center of that story is the Nile. It was there before the pyramids. It was there when temples covered the landscape. It was there when Alexandria became a center of the ancient world. It was there when Cairo rose to greatness. It witnessed the arrival of new faiths, new languages, new empires, and new nations. The river does not remember kings in the way humans do. It simply continues its journey northward, carrying water through a landscape where thousands of years of human history are layered upon one another. Along its banks, the past and present exist almost side by side. A farmer can work the same fertile valley where generations of farmers worked before him, while a modern city rises only miles away. That may be the greatest lesson of Egyptian history. Civilization is not preserved by monuments alone. Stone can survive for thousands of years. But a civilization survives because people continue to create, teach, remember, adapt, and rebuild. Egypt has done this repeatedly, through periods of greatness and periods of uncertainty. In 2026, Egypt faces problems that its ancient inhabitants could never have imagined. Population pressure, water security, economic challenges, climate change, regional conflict, and the demands of a rapidly changing world all shape its future. But Egypt has always been a country forced to live with change. Its history is, in many ways, the history of adapting to forces larger than any single generation. The pyramids remain silent. The temples no longer echo with the voices of ancient priests. The palaces of kings have become archaeological sites. The empires that once ruled Egypt exist now mainly in books, but the country itself is still alive. Children still grow up beside the Nile. Families still gather around meals. Students still study. Artists still create. Music still fills the streets. And somewhere beneath the modern noise of Cairo, beneath the traffic and concrete and lights, the older Egypt is still present. It exists in the river, in the language, in the food, in the architecture, in the stories passed from one generation to another, and in the memory of a civilization that has spent thousands of years learning how to survive. Perhaps That is why Egypt has fascinated humanity for so long. Its greatest achievement was never simply building the pyramids. It was building a civilization capable of enduring time itself. Rulers vanished, borders moved, religions changed, languages evolved. Yet something continued from one generation to the next. From the first villages along the Nile to the crowded streets of modern Cairo, the story is not a straight line. It is our river. It bends, divides, disappears beneath the surface, and emerges again. Every generation adds something to it, then passes the story forward. 5,000 years ago, people looked toward the Nile and began building a future they could not possibly imagine. Today, people still look toward that same river and wonder what comes next. The monuments remain behind us. The future remains ahead. And the story of Egypt continues, not as a memory of the ancient world, but as a civilization still alive. Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way through Egypt's story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you'd like to explore another chapter of history, you're welcome to join me for the next journey.